Joe was a typical resident of the big city, but he had an unusual hobby. He loved exploring the underground labyrinths of the metropolis. Sewers, old subway tunnels, abandoned mines, all these were places of adventure and adrenaline for him. One evening, when the city was bathed in lights, Joe descended into an old abandoned subway tunnel. He had noticed this passage a while ago and had been preparing for this day for several weeks. Today he had a feeling he would discover something special. Walking through the dark corridors, Joe carefully inspected the walls and floor, looking for hidden doors and passages. After some time, he stumbled upon a small, barely noticeable passage. It looked as if it hadn't been used in a long time. Joe squeezed inside and entered a narrow corridor, illuminated only by the light of his flashlight. Then something strange happened. Suddenly, the flashlight flickered and went out. Darkness enveloped him like a black shroud. Joe tried to turn the flashlight back on, but to no avail. Panic began to creep into his mind, but he quickly pulled himself together and moved forward by touch. After a few steps, he felt the walls widen, and the corridor turned into a room. Suddenly, his eyes began to adjust to the darkness, and a terrifying sight opened before him. In the corner of the room stood rusty metal tables, scattered with surgical instruments, all stained with blood. Along the walls were ropes, to which people were tied both alive and dead. Stumbled upon something soft. He turned around and saw a mannequin with a disfigured face. At that moment, he heard a rustling sound. Someone was moving at the opposite end of the room. Joe stood still, realizing he had stumbled into a maniac's lair. A figure emerged from the shadows. It was a tall man in a dirty jumpsuit with a mask covering his face. He looked straight at Joe, his eyes gleaming with malice. "Who are you and what are you doing here?" the man growled, approaching Joe. Joe backed away, looking for an exit. But the corridor through which he had come had vanished into the darkness. He was trapped. The maniac came closer and raised a knife, gleaming in the dim light. Joe tried to find something to defend himself with, but around him were only tables with instruments and remains. "You don't belong here," the maniac hissed, raising the knife. At that moment, Joe realized he had almost no chance of escape. He closed his eyes and prepared for the worst. But suddenly there was a deafening noise. The ceiling of the room began to collapse, and suddenly light broke through from above. Someone was breaking through the ceiling. The maniac was distracted by the noise, and Joe seized the moment. He grabbed the nearest instrument and lunged at the maniac. A struggle ensued. Joe felt the knife pierce his side, but adrenaline kept him fighting. He struck the maniac's head with the instrument, and the man fell to the floor. Bleeding, Joe ran towards the broken ceiling. Outside, he could hear the voices of rescuers. They had found him, thanks to reports of strange noises beneath the city. Joe reached out his hand and was grabbed, pulled out of the maniac's lair. He found himself on the surface, blinded by the bright light. Doctors quickly surrounded him, providing first aid. The last thing he remembered before losing consciousness was the sound of sirens and the faces of the rescuers. Waking up in the hospital, Joe learned that the police had found the maniac's lair and freed the remaining survivors. The maniac was arrested and now faced a long imprisonment. That night changed Joe's life forever. He never again ventured into the underground labyrinths, but his story became a legend among urban explorers, reminding them that even in the most familiar places, the most terrifying nightmares can hide.